They laughed at the uniform before they understood the man wearing it. On a gray Monday morning in Fairmont, Ohio, Officer Marcus Reed stepped into the main briefing room with his hat tucked beneath one arm and 27 years of service resting quietly on his shoulders. The room smelled like burnt coffee, printer paper, and rain carried in from the parking lot. The kind of ordinary police station morning where radios crackled softly and officers checked their phones while pretending to listen. But the moment Marcus walked through the door, the room changed. Not loudly at first, just a glance. Then another. Then a smirk from the back row. His uniform was clean, pressed, and buttoned straight to the collar, but it was old. The navy fabric had faded at the elbows. The brass buttons had been polished so many times they looked almost soft around the edges. His badge shone, but it carried scratches that no amount of polish could erase. To Marcus, those marks meant years. To some of the younger officers in that room, they meant weakness. Officer Blake Turner was the first one to laugh out loud. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms over his crisp new uniform, and let his voice travel just far enough for everyone to hear. Did the department run out of real uniforms? A few officers chuckled. One covered his mouth with a coffee cup. Another looked down at the table, smiling like silence made him innocent. Marcus heard every bit of it. He did not blink. He did not snap back. He simply walked to the front row, placed his hat on the table, and ran one careful hand across the nameplate above his heart. Read. 5 letters. A lifetime. Blake looked around, pleased with the attention. I'm serious, he added. That thing looks like it came out of a storage closet behind City Hall. We're supposed to be professionals, not a history exhibit. The laughter grew sharper this time. Not loud enough to be called cruel by anyone who wanted to deny it, but loud enough to cut. Sergeant Daniel Brooks, sitting near the side wall, lowered his eyes. He had known Marcus long enough to know that uniform was not a joke. He also knew why Marcus had chosen to wear it that morning. But he said nothing, and sometimes silence has its own weight. Marcus sat with his back straight, his hands folded, his eyes steady on the empty podium where the chief had not yet arrived. Outside, the rain tapped against the narrow windows. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed like they were trying to fill the space where respect should have been. Blake was not finished. Men like him rarely stopped when the room rewarded them. He leaned forward, staring at Marcus as if age, skin, and memory were all things a man could be mocked for carrying. You know, Reed, he said, people see us out there. They judge the whole department by how we show up. That uniform makes us look behind the times. For the first time, Marcus turned his head. Slowly, calmly. His face showed no anger, but something in his eyes made the nearest officers stop smiling. A uniform only matters, Marcus said, his voice low and even, when the person inside remembers what it stands for. The room went quiet for half a second, just long enough for truth to touch the walls. Then Blake gave a small, dismissive laugh and shook his head. Sounds nice, he muttered. Still looks old. Marcus looked back toward the front of the room. He did not explain that the cloth on his shoulders had once belonged to his father, Isaiah Reed, one of the first black officers ever assigned to patrol the East Ward. He did not explain that his father had worn that same badge style when some residents refused to open their doors to him and some fellow officers refused to ride beside him. He did not explain that every faded seam carried a story of a man who served a city that had not yet learned how to fully honor him. Marcus only sat there, breathing quietly, while the men who knew nothing about the uniform laughed at everything except the truth. Marcus had learned a long time ago that not every insult needed an answer. Some insults were not really questions. They were tests, quiet little traps set by people who wanted to pull your dignity down to their level and then blame you for bending. So he stayed still. He let the laughter fade into the corners of the briefing room while the rain outside kept tapping against the windows like a patient witness. Around him, the younger officers shifted in their chairs, some embarrassed now, some still amused, some pretending to scroll through messages so they would not have to choose a side. That was how disrespect survived inside good buildings. Not always through shouting. Sometimes through lowered eyes, nervous smiles, and people who told themselves it was not their place to speak. Marcus knew this room better than most of them ever would. He had walked these floors when the walls were still painted beige, when the dispatch desk sat near the entrance, when the old locker room heater rattled so loudly in winter that officers had to raise their voices just to be heard. He had reported for duty during snowstorms that left 6 inches on the cruisers. He had stood outside apartment buildings at 2 in the morning, not as a threat, but as the only familiar face a frightened family trusted enough to call. To the city, he was Officer Reed. To the East Ward, he was Marcus. Children waved at him from porches. Store owners kept coffee warm for him during late patrols. Elderly residents called the station and asked for him by name, not because he was the highest-ranking officer, but because he listened without making them feel small. That was the kind of authority no badge could create by itself. It had to be earned one conversation at a time. But inside the department, especially among officers like Blake Turner, that kind of work was easy to overlook. Blake was 31, tall, sharp-jawed, and polished in the way men become when they think appearance is the same thing as leadership. His uniform looked new enough to still hold the shape of the store hanger. His boots had no scuffs. His duty belt sat perfectly straight. He liked rules when they made him feel important and ignored history when it made him uncomfortable. To Blake, policing was about command presence, clean reports, fast answers, and being seen as the strongest person in the room. To Marcus, policing had always been about whether people breathed easier when you arrived. The difference between those two beliefs sat between them like an invisible line on the floor. Marcus glanced toward the framed photographs along the side wall. Old chiefs, retired captains, ceremony pictures from decades ago. In the far corner, almost hidden behind a filing cabinet, was a faded black-and-white photo from 1974. 5 officers stood in front of the old station steps. 4 white men in pressed uniforms, and 1 black man standing at the edge, shoulders squared, chin lifted, eyes straight ahead. Isaiah Reed, Marcus's father. Most people passed that picture without noticing him. Marcus never did. Every morning he saw it, and every morning he remembered what his father used to say while polishing his badge at the kitchen table. Son, this job can give you a badge, but it cannot give you character. You have to bring that yourself. Marcus carried those words the way other men carried medals. He did not need Blake to understand them. Not yet. Across the room, Sergeant Brooks finally lifted his head and looked toward the chief's closed office door. He had seen the calendar. He had seen the sealed envelope from the mayor's office. He knew something important was coming, something most of the room did not deserve to hear after what had just happened. But Marcus gave him the smallest shake of his head, almost invisible. Do not interfere. Let them show who they are. So Brooks stayed quiet, though his jaw tightened. Blake noticed none of it. He was still smiling, still mistaking patience for weakness, still unaware that the morning had not even truly begun. The chief's office door remained closed, and that small fact seemed to give Blake more courage than wisdom. He turned his chair sideways, one arm draped over the back, studying Marcus with the careless confidence of a man who had never been asked to carry someone else's history. So what is the occasion, Reed? He asked. Throwback day? Some kind of retirement warm-up? A few officers glanced toward Marcus, waiting to see if this would finally be the comment that cracked him. It did not. Marcus kept his hands folded on the table, his thumb resting lightly against the worn edge of his sleeve. The fabric had been repaired once near the cuff, so carefully that only someone looking closely would notice. The stitching. His mother had done that repair years ago, sitting under a yellow kitchen light after his father's funeral, moving the needle slowly because her hands were shaking too much to move quickly. Marcus had been 22 then, newly accepted into the academy, still trying to understand how a house could feel full one week and hollow the next. That night, his mother had placed the uniform across the table and said, "Your father never wanted you to wear this because of him. He wanted you to wear it only if you knew what it meant." Marcus had not answered her right away. He had only looked at the faded navy cloth, the polished brass, the name Reed sewn over the chest, and felt the weight of a road that had been cleared just enough for him to walk, but never enough for the walking to be easy. Years later, he still remembered the smell of starch and old cedar from the closet where that uniform had been kept. He remembered his father standing in front of the hallway mirror before dawn, tying his black tie with steady hands while the city outside was still sleeping. Isaiah Reed had not been a loud man. He did not give speeches about courage. He showed it by leaving the house each morning with his shoulders straight, knowing there were people who would question his authority before they heard his voice. Some residents did not trust him because of the badge. Some officers did not trust him because of his skin. He stood in the narrow space between both worlds and tried to do the job with honor anyway. That was the inheritance Marcus wore that morning. Not old fabric. Not nostalgia. A reminder. A promise. Blake could not see any of that. He saw faded sleeves and thought failure. He saw age and thought irrelevance. He saw a black officer who did not perform anger for him and mistook restraint for permission to keep going. Honestly, Blake said, louder now, this department has been trying to modernize its image. New outreach programs, new vehicles, new community standards. Then you walk in looking like you stepped out of a dusty yearbook. This time the laughter did not spread as easily. Something about the word yearbook made Sergeant Brooks look toward the old photograph in the corner, where Isaiah Reed's young face stared forward from 1974. Brooks cleared his throat, but Marcus spoke before he could. Careful, Turner, Marcus said softly. Blake raised his eyebrows. Careful of what? Marcus turned just enough to meet his eyes. Of confusing new with better. The words did not land loudly. They did not have to. They settled over the room, quiet and heavy. For a moment, even the rain seemed softer against the glass. Blake's smile tightened, and Marcus could see the irritation behind it. Men like Blake did not mind being cruel, but they hated being corrected without drama. Across the hall, a phone rang once inside the chief's office and stopped. Footsteps moved behind the closed door. Someone murmured. A drawer opened. Then silence returned. Marcus knew what time it was. He had known since 6:30 that morning, when Chief Harold Bennett had called him personally and asked him to arrive early, dressed in whatever uniform meant the most to him. Marcus had understood immediately. That was why he had opened the cedar closet before sunrise. That was why he had stood in front of his own mirror, wearing his father's legacy over his heart. Not to impress anyone, not to prove anything, but because some days ask a man to bring his whole story with him. The room had reached that strange point where everyone could feel the line had been crossed, but no one wanted to be the first to admit they had watched it happen. Blake leaned back again, trying to recover the easy laughter he had owned a few minutes earlier, but it did not come as cleanly now. The air felt different. He could feel it, and because he could feel it, he pushed harder. That was what insecure pride often did. It mistook discomfort for a challenge and kindness for surrender. Come on, Reed, Blake said, forcing a grin. Do not act like this is some sacred thing. It is a uniform. Cloth. Buttons. A badge. We all wear one. Marcus looked down at the table for a moment, not because he was ashamed, but because he was choosing his words with the care of a man who knew words could either build a bridge or burn one. Around him, the briefing room held its breath. Even the radios seemed quieter. Blake tapped 2 fingers against his own polished badge. The difference is some of us understand presentation. When people see me on the street, they know the department is sharp, current, professional. He paused, his eyes moving over Marcus from collar to cuffs. When they see that, they probably wonder why the city is still paying for a walking antique. This time, only one officer laughed, and even that laugh died quickly. Sergeant Brooks closed his eyes for a second. Officer Elena Morales, seated near the coffee machine, lowered her pen and stared at Blake with open disappointment. Marcus did not move. His face remained calm, but something in his stillness had changed. It was no longer just patience. It was sorrow, not for himself, for the room, for the badge, for every young officer who had learned how to polish leather but not how to honor people. Then Blake made the mistake that turned the morning from disrespectful to unforgettable. His gaze dropped to the nameplate on Marcus's chest, and he gave a short, careless chuckle. Reed, he said, that was your father too, right? The one in that old picture by the cabinet. No one answered. Marcus slowly lifted his eyes. Blake kept going, not noticing how Brooks had gone completely still. I mean, no offense, but if my father had worn the badge, I would want to make him proud. I would not show up looking like I pulled his old clothes out of a box. The silence came down fast. Heavy. Complete. It did not feel like quiet anymore. It felt like a door closing. Marcus turned fully toward Blake. He did not raise his voice. He did not stand. He did not point a finger. He simply looked at the younger officer with the steady pain of a man who had just heard ignorance step on a grave. My father wore this uniform, Marcus said, when there were people in this city who would not shake his hand, even after he helped them. Blake's smile faded, but he said nothing. Marcus continued, each word low, clear, and impossible to ignore. He wore it when some officers would not sit beside him in a cruiser. He wore it when he had to prove, every single day, that his badge was not borrowed, that his courage was not an accident, and that his place in this department was not a favor. No one moved. Outside, the rain slid down the windows in thin silver lines. Marcus placed his palm gently over the faded sleeve. So yes, Officer Turner, this uniform came out of a box. A cedar box in my closet. My mother kept it there because she said some things should not be thrown away just because the world forgets how much they cost. Blake swallowed. For the first time that morning, he looked unsure. But pride was still fighting inside him, still refusing to let humility speak first. Marcus gave him one last look and said, "My father would not be embarrassed by this uniform. He would be embarrassed by a room full of officers who forgot that respect is part of the job." No one laughed after that. After Marcus spoke, the briefing room became so quiet that every small sound seemed larger than it was. A chair leg shifted against the floor. Someone's pen rolled softly across the table. A radio at the back crackled with a distant call from dispatch, then faded into static. No one looked at Blake now. Not directly. That was part of the shame too. People often turned away from the person who caused the harm because looking at him meant admitting they had allowed him to go too far. Marcus did not need an apology in that moment. He had lived long enough to know that apologies made under pressure could sound clean while changing nothing. What he wanted, what he had always wanted, was understanding. The kind that did not disappear when the meeting ended. The kind that followed an officer into the street, into a traffic stop, into a living room where a mother was crying, into a neighborhood where trust had been broken long before the newest patrol car arrived. He looked around the room and saw faces he had watched grow into uniforms. Some were good people. Some were still learning. Some had joined the department for power, and some had joined because they genuinely believed service meant something. The problem was that the public could not always tell the difference until it was too late. Marcus had spent 27 years trying to make sure people in Fairmont saw, at least, one officer who remembered the human being before the complaint number, the address, the accent, the clothes, the fear. He remembered Mrs. Angela Price on Linden Avenue, 83 years old, who used to call the station every Thursday because teenagers gathered near her porch after school. Other officers had told her there was nothing they could do unless a crime was committed. Marcus had gone there himself, not with threats, not with lectures, but with 2 pizzas and a folding chair. He learned the boys' names. He asked about their grades. He found out one of them, Jamal, had not eaten dinner the night before. 2 months later, Marcus had that same group helping Mrs. Price carry groceries from the bus stop. That never made the news. He remembered a winter night when the temperature dropped below 20 degrees and a single father named Terrence was found sleeping in his car with his 7-year-old daughter because a paycheck had come late and the motel would not extend the room. Marcus did not treat him like a problem to remove. He called 3 churches, found a family shelter with space, and left 2 grocery cards in an envelope without his name on it. That never went into his official file. He remembered the summer after a tense neighborhood protest, when half the city seemed to be shouting past the other half. Marcus organized the first East Ward listening circle in the basement of New Hope Baptist Church. No cameras, no podium, just folding chairs, bottled water, and people saying what they had been carrying for years. Some officers refused to attend. Some residents refused to speak. But Marcus sat there for 4 hours and listened until the anger began to sound less like noise and more like pain. That was policing to him. Not control, not ego, not looking sharp beneath fluorescent lights. Presence, patience, accountability. The courage to hear what people really thought of the badge and still show up the next day determined to make it mean something better. Blake did not know those stories. Most of the room did not. Marcus had never been good at turning compassion into a career move. He simply did the work, day after day, block after block, family after family, while other men chased applause. Then, from behind the closed office door, came the sound of movement again. A low conversation. The chief's voice. Another voice Marcus recognized from City Hall. Sergeant Brooks looked toward the door, then back at Marcus. This time, Marcus did not shake his head. He only looked down at his father's sleeve and smoothed the fabric once, as if preparing it to be seen by people who might finally understand. The chief's office door opened before anyone in the room had fully recovered from the silence. Chief Harold Bennett stepped out first, a tall man in his early 60s with silver hair, tired eyes, and the careful posture of someone who had spent too many years watching good intentions bend under bad habits. He did not speak right away. He looked across the briefing room, and there was something in his expression that made several officers sit straighter. Behind him came a woman in a charcoal coat, her blonde hair tucked neatly behind one ear, a small city pin fastened near her collar. Mayor Caroline Whitmore did not enter like someone searching for attention. She entered like someone who knew the room already belonged to the truth she carried. Two city council members followed her, along with a communications director holding a folder embossed with the seal of Fairmont. Blake's face changed so quickly it was almost painful to watch. The confidence drained from it first, then the color, then the smile he had been wearing like armor. His eyes moved from the mayor to the chief, then to Marcus, then back to the mayor again, as if he were trying to rearrange the last 10 minutes into something less shameful. No one helped him. Chief Bennett walked to the podium and placed both hands on either side of it. "Good morning," he said, though his voice did not sound like a greeting. It sounded like a warning wrapped in professionalism. "Before we begin the scheduled briefing, we have guests from City Hall." Mayor Whitmore stepped beside him, holding the folder against her chest. Her gaze moved across the officers, warm but measured, until it settled on Marcus. When she saw his uniform, her expression softened in a way that told him. She understood more than most people in the room. "Officer Reed," she said, "would you please come forward?" For a moment, Marcus did not move. Not because he was surprised. He had known this was coming. But knowing a moment is coming does not make it lighter when it arrives. He stood slowly, his chair sliding back with a quiet scrape. Every eye followed him as he picked up his hat, squared his shoulders, and walked to the front of the room. The old uniform moved with him, faded sleeves, polished buttons, repaired cuff, nameplate steady over his heart. This time, no one laughed. Mayor Whitmore waited until Marcus stood beside her. Then she turned to the room. "Many of you know Officer Marcus Reed as a veteran member of this department," she began. "Some of you know him as a field training officer. Some of you know him as the officer who never asks for recognition and almost always refuses it when it is offered." A small smile touched her face, but it vanished quickly into something deeper. "The city knows him as something more." She opened the folder. Paper shifted softly. Blake stared at the floor. For nearly 3 decades, Officer Reed has served Fairmont with a level of patience, restraint, and human commitment that cannot be measured only by arrest statistics or monthly reports. He has helped build trust in neighborhoods where trust was almost gone. He has mentored young officers when no one assigned him to do it. He has stayed after shifts to help families navigate services, schools, shelters, and grief. He has represented this department not as a symbol of control, but as a promise of service. The words filled the room slowly, each one landing exactly where the earlier laughter had been. Marcus kept his eyes forward, but his throat tightened when the mayor turned the page. "And today," she continued, "on the anniversary of his father Isaiah Reed's first day of service in this department, the city is here to honor both legacy and leadership." Sergeant Brooks lowered his head. Officer Morales blinked hard. Blake did not move at all. Mayor Whitmore looked back at Marcus, her voice steady. "Officer Reed, your father helped open a door that should never have been closed. You spent your career making sure more people could walk through it with dignity. That is why this city is not here merely to thank you. We are here to ask you to lead." Mayor Whitmore let the final word hang in the air, and for a few seconds the room seemed unable to breathe around it. Lead. Not assist. Not support. Not advise from the background while younger men with louder voices took the credit. Lead. Marcus stood beside her with his hat held at his side, his face composed, but beneath that calm there was a deep movement of memory. He thought of his father stepping into this same department when the city still treated his presence as an experiment. He thought of his mother smoothing that uniform with trembling hands. He thought of every long night when doing the right thing had felt invisible. Now all of it stood with him at the front of the room. Mayor Whitmore opened the folder wider and read from the official document. By recommendation of Chief Harold Bennett, unanimous approval of the Fairmont City Council Public Safety Committee, and authorization from the Office of the Mayor, Officer Marcus Elijah Reed is hereby appointed Deputy Chief of Community Trust and Field Ethics, effective immediately. The words did not explode. They landed. Solid. Clean. Final. Then the room changed. Chairs shifted. Officers sat upright. A few mouths opened slightly and closed again. Someone near the back whispered, "Deputy Chief," as if the title had rearranged the walls. Sergeant Brooks was the first to stand. Not quickly, not for show. He rose with the slow respect of a man who understood the weight of the moment. Then Officer Morales stood. Then another officer. Then another. Within seconds, the room that had laughed at Marcus Reed was on its feet before him. Blake remained seated half a breath too long, trapped between embarrassment and disbelief, until he realized everyone could see him. Then he stood too, stiffly, his eyes fixed somewhere below Marcus's shoulder. Chief Bennett stepped forward with a small black case. Inside was a new command insignia, polished bright under the fluorescent lights. But before he reached for it, Marcus lifted one hand. "Gently, Chief," he said, "with your permission." Bennett paused. Marcus looked down at the old uniform, then at the new insignia. "I would like to wear it on this uniform today." The chief's expression softened. "I was hoping you would say that." No one in the room moved as Bennett pinned the insignia carefully above Marcus's badge. The bright metal against the faded navy cloth said more than a speech could have said. It told the room that progress did not mean throwing history away. It meant finally giving history the rank it had earned. Mayor Whitmore stepped back, allowing the department to see him fully. Marcus Reed, son of Isaiah Reed, wearing a uniform older than some of the officers who had mocked it, now standing as their deputy chief. Blake looked at him then, really looked at him, and the arrogance on his face had nowhere left to hide. Marcus did not stare him down. He did not smile in victory. That would have been too small for the moment. Instead, he looked across the whole room, including the ones who had laughed, the ones who had stayed silent, and the ones who were only now beginning to understand. "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice steady. "This honor belongs to more than me. It belongs to every person who served without being fully welcomed. It belongs to every family that had to teach their children dignity before the world taught them fairness. And it belongs to every officer in this room who still has time to decide what kind of badge they are going to wear." The room remained standing, but now it felt less like ceremony and more like confession. Blake's jaw tightened. His eyes dropped. For the first time that morning, he seemed smaller, not because Marcus had humiliated him, but because truth had made his pride unnecessary. Marcus turned slightly toward the old photograph by the filing cabinet, where Isaiah Reed stood at the edge of history with his chin lifted. For one quiet second, father and son seemed to share the room. Then Marcus faced forward again, the new insignia shining over the old cloth, and the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was respect. The applause did not come right away. It began as a single pair of hands. Near the side wall, slow and uncertain, then another, until the sound filled the briefing room with something that felt less like celebration and more like correction. Marcus accepted it with a quiet nod, but he did not bask in it. Applause had never been the reason he stayed. Recognition had never been the reason he answered calls after midnight, sat with grieving parents, or walked into tense rooms with open hands and a steady voice. Still, as the sound rose around him, he allowed himself one breath of gratitude. Not for the title, for the fact that his father's uniform had lived long enough to be seen differently. Mayor Whitmore closed the folder and looked toward Chief Bennett, who understood without being told. The chief stepped back to the podium and waited until the room settled. "Before we move forward," he said, "there is something else that needs to be addressed." The applause faded. Chairs creaked as officers sat again, but Blake remained standing for a second too long, as if he had forgotten what to do with his own body. Chief Bennett's eyes found him. "Officer Turner." Blake looked up. "Yes, Chief." His voice had lost its sharpness. "You and I will speak privately after this meeting," Bennett said. "But this is not only about a private conversation. What happened in this room concerns the entire department." No one moved. The chief's voice stayed even, which somehow made it heavier. "Professionalism is not just how polished your badge is. It is how you treat people when you think status is on your side. It is how you speak when you believe the person in front of you cannot answer back. It is whether you understand that a uniform carries responsibility before it carries authority." Blake swallowed and nodded once. "Yes, Chief." But Marcus could hear that the nod was not enough. A nod could be survival. Understanding required more. Mayor Whitmore looked at Blake, not with anger, but with the kind of disappointment that offered no hiding place. "Officer Turner," she said, "this city is investing in a new model of public trust. Deputy Chief Reed will lead that work. Every officer assigned under him will be expected to learn not only procedure, but history, restraint, and respect." Blake's eyes flickered toward Marcus. The word underlanded harder than any punishment could have. Chief Bennett continued, "Effective this week, Officer Turner will be reassigned to the Community Trust Training Initiative. He will complete field mentorship under Deputy Chief Reed for 90 days, including neighborhood meetings, youth outreach, and complaint review sessions." A low shift moved through the room, not laughter this time, but realization. Blake's face tightened. For a moment, pride rose in him again, visible in the set of his jaw. Then he looked at Marcus, at the old uniform, at the new insignia, at the room full of witnesses, and the pride had nowhere useful to go. "Understood," Blake said quietly. Marcus watched him carefully. He did not enjoy the younger man's embarrassment. That was the difference between justice and revenge. Revenge wants a person reduced. Justice wants a person restored, but only after the truth has done its work. Marcus stepped closer to the podium. "Chief, Mayor, may I say something?" Bennett nodded. The room turned back to him. Marcus looked directly at Blake, but his words were for everyone. Respect is easy when it is written in a policy manual. It is harder when it walks into a room wearing something you do not understand. That is when your character speaks before you do. Blake lowered his eyes. Marcus continued, his voice calm, almost gentle. "Officer Turner, your first assignment with me will not be paperwork. Tomorrow morning at 8, we will visit the East Ward. You will meet Mrs. Price on Linden Avenue. You will meet the kids at the community center. You will meet people who do not care how new your uniform is. They care whether you see them." The room stayed silent. Marcus glanced once at the photograph of his father, then back at the officers before him. "That is the job," he said. "Not being feared, not being admired, being worthy of trust." And in that moment, Blake finally nodded in a way that did not look like obedience. It looked like the beginning of shame becoming a lesson. The meeting ended, but no one left the room the way they had entered it. Something had shifted, quietly but permanently, like a picture on a wall being straightened after years of hanging crooked. Officers gathered their notebooks without the usual jokes. Chairs slid back softly. Boots moved across the floor with a slower kind of care. Blake Turner stood near the back table, staring at the empty coffee cup in his hand as if it held an answer he could not find. A few minutes earlier, he had believed the room belonged to people like him. Men who could laugh first and think later. Men who assumed a polished uniform meant a polished soul. Now he understood that he had not been standing above Marcus Reed. He had been standing in the shadow of a history he had never bothered to learn. Marcus remained near the front, speaking quietly with Mayor Whitmore and Chief Bennett. The new insignia caught the fluorescent light every time he turned, but what people kept noticing was not the shine of the metal. It was the faded fabric beneath it. Somehow the old uniform looked different now. Not newer, not cleaner, greater, as if the room had finally learned how to read it. When the mayor left, she paused by the old photograph near the filing cabinet. She looked at Isaiah Reed's face for a long moment, then back at Marcus. "Your father would be proud," she said. Marcus nodded once, but he did not answer right away. His throat tightened around words too private for a crowded room. Finally, he said, "I hope he would believe we are still trying." That was all. Simple. Honest. Enough. Across the room, Blake took one step forward, then stopped. Pride still pulled at him, but shame had begun doing its quieter work. He approached Marcus slowly after the others started filing out. Sergeant Brooks watched from the doorway, not interfering this time. Blake stood in front of the man he had mocked and seemed suddenly unsure how to hold his own hands. "Deputy Chief Reed," he said, and the title sounded awkward in his mouth because humility was new there. Marcus turned toward him. Blake swallowed. "What I said earlier was wrong. Not just disrespectful. Wrong. I did not understand what that uniform meant." Marcus studied him for a moment. "No," he said calmly. "You did not." Blake nodded, accepting the weight of it. "I am sorry." Marcus did not rush to forgive him just to make the moment comfortable. Real respect could not be handed out like a clean report at the end of a shift. It had to be practiced. "Tomorrow morning," Marcus said, "bring a notebook. Wear comfortable shoes. We will walk most of the East Ward before lunch." Blake looked surprised. "Walk, walk," Marcus repeated. You cannot learn a neighborhood from behind a windshield. You learn it by knowing which porch belongs to the grandmother everyone checks on, which corner store lets kids wait inside when it rains, which block stopped calling because they thought no one would come. Blake looked down, then back up. Yes, sir. The next morning, the rain was gone, and Fairmont woke under a pale blue sky. At 8 o'clock, Blake stood outside the station in his spotless uniform, notebook in hand. Marcus came down the steps wearing the same old uniform, the new insignia resting above the same old badge. Together they walked toward East Ward, not as equals yet, not as friends, but as two officers stepping into a lesson that could not be taught in a briefing room. By noon, Blake had met Mrs. Price, who hugged Marcus like family. He had watched children at the community center run toward the deputy chief without fear. He had listened to a store owner explain why trust took years to build and seconds to lose. And for the first time, Blake began to understand that the badge did not make people look up to you the way you carried it did. Years later, officers would still talk about the morning Marcus Reed was promoted. Some remembered the mayor. Some remembered Blake's silence. But the ones who truly understood remembered the uniform. They remembered how they had mistaken age for weakness, humility for irrelevance, and silence for defeat. They thought the cloth was old, but it was the only thing in that room that still remembered what honor looked like.